Kublai Khan is a name that echoes across history. To many, he is remembered as the great Mongol ruler who established the Yuan Dynasty in China, a man of vision, wealth, and immense power. His empire stretched farther than almost any before him, and his court dazzled travelers like Marco Polo, who described riches beyond imagination. To most people, Kublai Khan is a symbol of conquest and authority, a larger-than-life figure who brought different worlds together under his rule. That is the image history has preserved. A wise emperor who stood at the crossroads of East and West, guiding his people into an age of influence and prosperity. But there is another story, one that is rarely told. A story not of glory, but of cruelty. Behind the grand palaces and endless feasts was a world built on suffering. A hidden side of Kublai Khan's reign reveals how power without limit can twist a man into something monstrous. The truth is darker than the legends, and what you are about to hear will challenge everything you thought you knew about one of history's most famous rulers. Kublai Khan's empire was vast, and so was his hunger for domination. It was not only lands and kingdoms he sought to control, but also the bodies and lives of thousands of women who were trapped inside his palaces. His harem was not a mere symbol of luxury. It was a machine of exploitation, a system designed to satisfy his every desire without regard for the humanity of those who lived within it. Accounts from the time describe thousands of women taken from across the empire. Their beauty was their curse. They were captured, purchased, or demanded as tribute from conquered regions. Officials scoured villages and towns, searching for young girls who fit the standards of perfection set by the court. Most of these girls were barely into their teenage years, often chosen between the ages of 14 and 16. Once selected, they were stripped and examined to ensure their health and beauty. Those who passed this degrading process were sent directly into the Khan's world, where their lives would be consumed by fear and control. The recruitment itself was an act of violence. Families had no power to refuse. To deny the emperor's order was to risk punishment or death. Parents watched as their daughters were taken away, knowing they would never return to the lives they once knew. For the young women, the journey into the palace was the beginning of a nightmare. They were cut off from their homes, forbidden from speaking their native languages, and stripped of their identities. Many were given new names chosen by the court, names that erased their past and forced them into a role designed only to serve the Khan. These girls were not wives, nor even mistresses. They were possessions, catalogued and controlled like livestock. Their worth was not measured by who they were, but by how well they pleased the emperor. Every interaction was dictated by strict rituals, and failure to meet the expectations could mean banishment, humiliation, or even death. Inside the harem, fear was constant. The women lived under the watch of eunuchs and officials who enforced the rules of the palace. Privacy did not exist. Each day could bring a new test, a new demand, a new punishment for the slightest mistake. The Khan's power was absolute, and his moods determined the fate of countless women. One moment of displeasure could ruin a life forever. Some women vanished from the palace altogether, never to be seen again, while others were cast aside into a lifetime of servitude once they lost their youthful appeal. What appeared on the surface as a palace of pleasure was, in truth, a prison. For the women inside, every day was survival, and every night carried the weight of fear. The scale of this system is almost impossible to grasp. Contemporary sources describe hundreds of women in a single palace, and some reports stretch into the thousands. The harem was not simply a private indulgence. It was an institution, woven into the very fabric of Kublai Khan's rule. To sustain it, officials carried out yearly searches across the empire. They scoured villages in China, Mongolia, Central Asia, and beyond. Every year, new girls were taken, inspected, and forced into a life they did not choose. It was a ritual of cruelty dressed as tradition. The empire's reach meant that no family was truly safe from the possibility of losing a daughter. For many communities, the arrival of imperial officials became a season of dread, a time when the young and the beautiful might simply vanish. Those who resisted did not stand a chance. The orders came from the emperor himself, and disobedience meant ruin. Inside the walls of the palace, life was a constant test of obedience. Women were trained to perform acts designed not for love or intimacy, but for the satisfaction of the emperor. Their entire existence was reduced to ritualized service, where every gesture and every glance was monitored. This was not private behavior hidden in secrecy. It was open, systematic, and sanctioned by the state. Eunuchs, castrated men who served as guardians of the harem, ensured that the rules were followed. They recorded who was chosen, who was favored, and who was discarded. The women lived in a hierarchy that determined everything about their lives, where they slept, what they ate, and even how they walked. Rising in this system meant pleasing the Khan, while falling meant humiliation or disappearance. Consent was never part of this world. The very idea of choice was erased. The young women were treated like objects of exchange, their lives reduced to their ability to serve the pleasures of one man. Many were gifted away to officials when they were no longer of interest to the Khan, as if they were trinkets or trophies to be handed out for loyalty. In this way, their bodies became currency, tokens of imperial power. Those who remained in the palace often lived in silence, afraid to speak their minds or even show emotion. To display sadness, anger, or defiance was to invite punishment. The palace may have been decorated with gold and silk, but for those who lived there, it was a gilded cage. The fear that ruled their days was not only about punishment, but also about uncertainty. The women never knew what would happen to them next. One day they could be summoned to the Khan's chambers, showered in attention, and placed temporarily at the center of the palace's hierarchy. The next day, without warning, they could be cast aside, ignored, or punished for something as small as failing to meet his gaze in the expected manner. This unpredictability created a state of constant anxiety. It was not enough to obey. They had to anticipate, to read moods, to predict whims. And even then, safety was never guaranteed. Living under such conditions eroded not only their sense of dignity, but their very sense of self. They were made to believe they were expendable, that their lives held no meaning beyond their ability to entertain the emperor. The fate of those who lost favor was particularly grim. Women who aged beyond the desired years, or who displeased the Khan in any way, were often sent away. Some were given to lesser nobles or officials as concubines, a transaction that reduced them to tokens of gratitude. Others were forced into menial labor, spending the rest of their lives in servitude far removed from the luxury of the palace. For many, the end was even darker. Some accounts suggest that women who fell completely from grace could be executed, silenced forever to ensure no whispers of discontent escaped the palace walls. In this way, their stories disappeared along with them, erased from history, just as their identities had been erased in life. Even the children born in these palaces were not safe. If a child was born to a favored woman, that child might be raised within the imperial household, molded to serve the dynasty. But many children, especially those born to women who were cast aside, faced a different fate. Some were raised as servants, stripped of any claim to inheritance, destined to live in the shadow of their father's empire. Others were simply not allowed to live at all. Infanticide was a quiet yet chilling part of the system, a method of ensuring that only the children deemed useful or legitimate could survive. The palace, then, was not only a prison for women, but also a place where life and death for children depended on the shifting preferences of one man. What made all of this possible was not only the cruelty of Kublai Khan himself, but the absolute power he wielded. There were no checks, no laws to protect the women, no voices strong enough to challenge him. His authority was beyond question, and with that authority came the freedom to indulge in every whim without consequence. This lack of accountability allowed a system of sexual slavery to flourish, normalized within the empire as if it were no more unusual than collecting taxes or building roads. It was power without restraint, and it corrupted everything it touched. To outsiders dazzled by the wealth of the court, it might have seemed like magnificence. To those trapped inside, it was a nightmare that never ended. The cruelty went beyond the physical acts. It extended deep into the minds of the women trapped inside. Stripped of their names, their languages, and their families, they were left with no identity except the one forced upon them. Their pasts were erased. They were expected to forget who they once were, to abandon their roots and become nothing more than shadows moving in the background of the emperor's world. This psychological breaking was as deliberate as any physical control. It was a way of ensuring that the women were not just prisoners of the body, but prisoners of the spirit as well. For those who have studied history only through the lens of conquest and empire, it can be difficult to imagine how such cruelty could exist within the same man who commanded armies and built dynasties. Yet absolute power has a way of erasing boundaries between public authority and private indulgence. Kublai Khan's palaces were not only centers of government, but also theaters of personal dominance. Every corridor, every chamber, every garden became part of a system where women were kept as symbols of his control. They were displayed as ornaments during ceremonies, paraded in ways that suggested wealth and splendor. To foreign visitors, these women might have looked like attendants or courtiers. But beneath the surface of silk robes and painted smiles lay lives crushed under the weight of fear and humiliation. One of the most disturbing aspects of this system was how routine it became. The recruitment of young women was not an occasional act, but an institutionalized process. Officials were instructed to find candidates year after year, ensuring that the harem never dwindled. This cycle meant that entire generations of young girls were swallowed into the palace walls, leaving behind families who mourned in silence. For the empire, it was treated as administration. For the victims, it was the end of freedom, identity, and often hope. Such repetition turned cruelty into policy, embedding exploitation into the very fabric of the dynasty. It was not the secret vice of one man, but a structure that required countless officials, guards, and servants to maintain. Inside, the dehumanization was relentless. Women were stripped not only of their pasts, but of their ability to form bonds. Speaking their native languages was forbidden. Their names were often changed to titles or labels that reduced them to roles rather than people. This deliberate erasure created a sense of isolation. Even surrounded by others, each woman was made to feel alone, disconnected from who she once was, and cut off from those who might share her pain. The psychological damage was deep. To live without the ability to express yourself in your own tongue is to live as a stranger in your own skin. This silencing was as much a weapon as any physical chain, ensuring obedience through the destruction of identity. Fear of punishment kept this system intact. Rumors of torture spread quietly among the women, whispered warnings of what happened to those who disobeyed or even displeased the emperor by accident. A misplaced word, a poorly timed glance, or even the suspicion of defiance could end in humiliation or worse. Some were beaten, others banished, and still others simply disappeared, their absence explained away or ignored by those too afraid to question it. This uncertainty was part of the design. It ensured that no one ever felt secure, that obedience was not only expected, but desperately clung to as a means of survival. To resist was unthinkable. To complain was impossible. And so silence reigned, broken only by the commands of the emperor and the footsteps of those who enforced his will. The more one looks at the inner workings of Kublai Khan's court, the more it becomes clear that cruelty was not an accident, but a system. It was a carefully designed order of dominance that reinforced the emperor's image as untouchable. In a society where loyalty to the ruler was considered sacred, questioning his personal actions was unthinkable. This silence gave him complete freedom to indulge in excess. The grandeur of the Yuan court dazzled outsiders, but the splendor was built on the suffering of those trapped within the palaces. Gold, jewels, and silk concealed the misery of countless women who had been taken from their homes and forced into lives of servitude. Every feast, every celebration, every display of wealth rested on the quiet sacrifices of those who were never allowed to speak their truth. It is easy for history to present figures like Kublai Khan as brilliant rulers who shaped nations. What is harder to face is the cost of that power. Behind the victories on the battlefield and the political strategies lay the broken lives of young women reduced to possessions. Their stories are rarely told because history was written by those who served the emperor, not those who suffered under him. The official records celebrated his achievements, describing his governance, his economic reforms, and his vision of empire. But they left out the cries of the women whose futures were destroyed in his name. To uncover this hidden side is to confront the truth that greatness often came at a price paid by the most vulnerable. The use of women as instruments of power extended beyond the walls of the harem. Concubines who fell out of favor were sometimes gifted to visiting nobles or foreign envoys as displays of generosity. These exchanges were political tools, turning human beings into bargaining chips. To the recipients, such gifts symbolized honor and trust. To the women themselves, it was nothing more than another layer of exploitation. Their bodies were traded to strengthen alliances, a cruel reminder that they had no control over their own destinies. Even after leaving the palace, they carried with them the scars of what they had endured, both physical and emotional. The children born from these unions faced a life no less tragic. Those considered legitimate heirs were closely guarded, groomed to serve the empire. But the majority were denied recognition, growing up in the shadows of a father who never acknowledged them. Some were forced into servitude from an early age, their existence tolerated only because they could be useful. Others were discarded entirely. The decision often depended on nothing more than the shifting moods of the emperor or the political calculations of his court. In this way, even innocent children bore the weight of a system built on cruelty. As the years passed, the cycle continued. Each new generation of officials repeated the same patterns, ensuring the harem remained full and the emperor's desires were always met. No one dared question the morality of this system because his word was law. This absolute authority created a culture where abuse was normalized and suffering was invisible to those in power. The empire itself became complicit, feeding into the cycle of exploitation that defined Kublai Khan's private world. To understand the depth of this corruption, one must recognize that Kublai Khan's empire was not simply about governing lands and people. It was also about shaping a narrative of invincibility. The emperor's harem became a stage where his dominance was displayed not only to his court, but also to the world. Visitors who marveled at his palaces saw the wealth, the abundance, and the number of attendants who surrounded him. To them, it was evidence of greatness, but they could not see the fear etched into the faces of the women who lived behind those walls. The empire's propaganda worked by disguising control as magnificence. This deception allowed the emperor to maintain his image while concealing the human suffering that fueled it. The system itself could not have survived without countless hands to maintain it. Eunuchs acted as guards and overseers, enforcing rules with an iron grip. Palace officials managed records, deciding who was chosen and who was discarded. Regional governors supplied the young women, treating the recruitment process as part of their administrative duties. Each of these roles contributed to the machinery of abuse. It was not the cruelty of one man alone, but a structure supported by many, all of whom benefited from the emperor's favor. This collaboration made the harem more than just a private indulgence. It became an institution, as much a part of the empire as its armies or its taxes. For the women inside, The lack of escape was perhaps the cruelest reality. The walls of the palace were high, guarded by loyal soldiers, and escape attempts were punished severely. Even if a woman managed to flee, she could never return to her family without endangering them. The shame imposed by the system was designed to silence not only the women, but also their communities. Families learned to grieve quietly, knowing that speaking out against the emperor would mean destruction. This collective silence stretched across the empire, ensuring that the suffering of thousands remained hidden beneath the surface of history. The psychological toll of such a life cannot be overstated. To live every day under surveillance, to be told that your worth lies only in your ability to please, and to know that your fate could change at any moment, created a despair that slowly consumed the spirit. Some women tried to find ways to endure, clinging to small routines or forming quiet bonds with others. But even these fragile comforts were dangerous, as suspicion of disobedience could tear them apart. Isolation was complete, and it was intentional. It kept the women powerless, unable to unite or resist, ensuring that the system endured unchallenged. Kublai Khan's absolute control meant that his personal desires shaped the lives of thousands. His empire may have been vast, but his palace reflected the darker side of that greatness. It was a world where cruelty became normal, where suffering was disguised as splendor, and where human beings were reduced to shadows in the service of one man's unchecked power. This was not an accident of history, but a deliberate choice, and it left scars that outlasted even the dynasty itself. As Kublai Khan's rule stretched on, the pattern of indulgence and cruelty became deeply embedded in the culture of his court. What began as personal excess grew into a symbol of imperial authority. The harem was not hidden in shame. It was flaunted as a sign of wealth and strength. The emperor's power was measured not only by the territories he controlled, but also by the number of women confined within his walls. This grotesque display turned human suffering into a spectacle, transforming lives into mere decorations of empire. Foreign envoys often described the splendor of the court without grasping the despair that lay beneath it. To them, it was a marvel. To the women, it was a life sentence. Every layer of the palace hierarchy reinforced this nightmare. Favored women were elevated temporarily, enjoying privileges that set them apart from the rest. Yet even at the height of favor, they lived under the constant threat of sudden dismissal. What looked like power was fragile, dependent entirely on the emperor's mood. Those who fell from grace discovered how quickly they could lose everything. Yesterday's favorite could become tomorrow's servant. This volatility created rivalry and suspicion among the women, which further ensured they could not unite against the system. Division was part of the design, keeping them focused on survival rather than resistance. For those banished from favor, the descent was brutal. Some were forced to work in service roles far from the luxury of the harem, washing clothes or preparing food for others. Some were given away like trinkets to visiting guests or loyal officials, their bodies used as bargaining chips in political games. The act of gifting women as rewards stripped them of the last shred of dignity, reducing them to objects of transaction. Once they were no longer useful, their fate was uncertain and often grim. There were whispers of disappearances, of women executed quietly so their presence would no longer be a reminder of discontent. The palace was a world where vanishing was common and silence was the rule. The suffering of these women did not end with them alone. Their families bore the weight of loss, living with the knowledge that their daughters had been taken but unable to speak of it openly. For the empire, these families became invisible. Their grief was swallowed by fear, hidden away like a dangerous secret. To mourn too loudly was to risk punishment. Communities learned to endure quietly, normalizing tragedy as part of life under imperial rule. This silence ensured that the emperor's reputation remained untarnished in official records, while the true cost of his reign was buried with the forgotten voices of countless women. The moral decay within the palace was mirrored in the empire itself. When the ruler of a vast nation indulges in cruelty without consequence, it sends a message to everyone beneath him. Corruption, exploitation, and indifference to suffering seeped through the ranks of officials and into the lives of ordinary people. Kublai Khan's personal sins were not contained behind palace walls. They became part of the culture of governance. The empire reflected the emperor, and what it reflected was a world where human lives were disposable in the pursuit of power. The deeper one looks into this period, the clearer it becomes that Kublai Khan's harem was more than a personal indulgence. It was a mirror of unchecked authority. In every corner of the palace, the evidence of absolute power was visible. Women did not exist as individuals, but as symbols of conquest. Their origins from distant provinces were reminders of the empire's reach, and their captivity was proof of the emperor's dominance over all he surveyed. To Kublai Khan, surrounding himself with women from every corner of his realm was not only about pleasure, but also about demonstrating control. It was empire condensed into flesh and silence. For the women inside, life was reduced to a cycle of waiting, fearing, and enduring. They waited for summonses that could mean either temporary favor or sudden ruin. They feared every whisper of displeasure, every flicker of the emperor's temper. They endured the constant knowledge that their lives were not their own. In such an environment, hope faded quickly. A girl brought in at 14 could watch years slip away with no promise of freedom, no chance of returning home, and no voice to tell her story. Even the most resilient spirits were eventually broken by the endless repetition of fear and uncertainty. The methods of control reached far beyond physical confinement. Psychological tactics ensured obedience without the need for open rebellion. By renaming the women, forbidding their languages, and cutting them off from their roots, the court severed every tie that might have given them strength. They became isolated not only from the outside world, but also from each other. Suspicion was encouraged, trust was discouraged, and rivalry was cultivated. A system that might have been vulnerable to collective defiance instead thrived on division. Each woman was made to believe she stood alone, and in that isolation, resistance became impossible. The fate of unwanted concubines reveals the depth of the cruelty. Those no longer desired were not given the dignity of choice. They might be sent to work in the most menial positions, stripped of even the small comforts of palace life. Others were used as bargaining tokens, passed into the hands of officials who saw them as rewards rather than human beings. And some simply vanished, their existence erased as if they had never lived. Such erasures served the emperor well, for silence left no witnesses, no testimonies, and no scars visible to the outside world. Yet behind every disappearance lay a shattered life, a family left in despair, and a history deliberately forgotten. All of this was possible because of one undeniable fact. Kublai Khan answered to no one. His word was law, his desires were command, and his actions were beyond reproach. No court, no advisor, no official dared challenge him. This absence of accountability turned cruelty into normality. When power is absolute, morality becomes irrelevant. What mattered was not justice or humanity, but the will of the ruler. And under Kublai Khan, that will demanded obedience, silence, and suffering. When history remembers Kublai Khan, it often paints the picture of a mighty emperor who built bridges between East and West. Yet the darker truth is that his bridges were built on broken lives. The very structure of his empire reflected the corruption of his personal world. The palace became the heart of this corruption, radiating its influence outward. Officials who learned cruelty at court carried it into the provinces. The silence that ruled within the palace became the silence of the people who feared their ruler. This culture of fear was not accidental. It was cultivated, strengthened by the knowledge that even the smallest act of defiance could end in destruction. For those outside, the emperor's glory was dazzling. For those inside, it was suffocating. The tragedy of the women in Kublai Khan's harem is not only that they were taken, but also that their stories were erased. The empire did not record their names, their sorrows, or their voices. They became invisible, lost in the shadows of history. What remains are fragments, whispers in foreign accounts, brief mentions in records that celebrated the emperor's magnificence while ignoring the pain that made it possible. This deliberate forgetting was another form of cruelty. To be stripped of identity in life was terrible. To be denied remembrance in death was final. The silence of history is often as brutal as the silence of the palace. And yet, when we look closely, the signs of moral decay are clear. A ruler who could take without consent, discard without thought, and command without limits left behind not just a legacy of conquest, but also a legacy of suffering. His greatness was measured in cities and battles, but his corruption was measured in lives stolen, futures destroyed, and innocence erased. The cost of his reign was not only political, but deeply personal for those caught in his web of power. It was a cost that history rarely calculates because it cannot be measured in maps or monuments. It can only be measured in silence, in grief, and in the absence of voices that should have been heard. As time went on, the system hardened. It became tradition. Ritualized cruelty passed from one generation of officials to the next. To question it was to question the emperor himself, and that was unthinkable. The result was a dynasty built not only on conquest, but on dehumanization. The very foundations of the Yuan Dynasty were soaked in this silent suffering. While the emperor's armies marched outward to expand borders, his palace consumed lives inward, reducing human beings to mere tools of pleasure and control. This duality, glory on the outside, horror on the inside, defines the hidden truth of Kublai Khan's reign. What makes this story even more disturbing is how normal it all seemed at the time. For the people who lived under his rule, the existence of such a harem was not questioned. It was accepted as part of imperial life, as natural as taxes or military campaigns. This normalization of cruelty ensured that it could endure without challenge. When abuse becomes ordinary, it becomes invisible, and when it becomes invisible, it thrives unchecked. That is the legacy Kublai Khan left behind, one that demands to be uncovered and remembered. The story of Kublai Khan's hidden world reaches its climax in the realization of how many lives were consumed by it. Thousands of women were taken from their homes, stripped of their identities, and forced into a cycle of exploitation that left no space for hope. Children born into this system were condemned to futures shaped by their father's cruelty rather than their own potential. Families across the empire carried wounds that could never heal, mourning daughters who were never returned. The scale of suffering is almost impossible to imagine, yet it is essential to confront it if we are to understand the true cost of absolute power. This is where the legend of the wise emperor falls apart. History has often celebrated Kublai Khan as a visionary leader who united cultures and expanded trade. But hidden beneath those stories lies a reality that challenges every notion of greatness. What good are roads and markets when they are built on the backs of the broken? What glory can be claimed by a ruler who could not control his own hunger for domination? To view him only as a figure of progress is to ignore the voices of those who are silenced. True history demands that we see both sides, the public victories and the private horrors. Only then can we grasp the full picture of who he was. The tragedy of the women in Kublai Khan's harem is not only that they were taken, but also that their stories were erased. The empire did not record their names, their sorrows, or their voices. They became invisible, lost in the shadows of history. What remains are fragments, whispers in foreign accounts, brief mentions in records that celebrated the emperor's magnificence while ignoring the pain that made it possible. This deliberate forgetting was another form of cruelty. To be stripped of identity in life was terrible. To be denied remembrance in death was final. The silence of history is often as brutal as the silence of the palace. And yet, when we look closely, the signs of moral decay are clear. A ruler who could take without consent, discard without thought, and command without limits left behind not just a legacy of conquest, but also a legacy of suffering. His greatness was measured in cities and battles, but his corruption was measured in lives stolen, futures destroyed, and innocence erased. The cost of his reign was not only political, but deeply personal for those caught in his web of power. It was a cost that history rarely calculates, because it cannot be measured in maps or monuments. It can only be measured in silence, in grief, and in the absence of voices that should have been heard. As time went on, the system hardened. It became tradition, ritualized cruelty passed from one generation of officials to the next. To question it was to question the emperor himself, and that was unthinkable. The result was a dynasty built not only on conquest, but on dehumanization. The very foundations of the Yuan Dynasty were soaked in this silent suffering. While the emperor's armies marched outward to expand borders, his palace consumed lives inward, reducing human beings to mere tools of pleasure and control. This duality, glory on the outside, horror on the inside, defines the hidden truth of Kublai Khan's reign. What makes this story even more disturbing is how normal it all seemed at the time. For the people who lived under his rule, the existence of such a harem was not questioned. It was accepted as part of imperial life, as natural as taxes or military campaigns. This normalization of cruelty ensured that it could endure without challenge. When abuse becomes ordinary, it becomes invisible, and when it becomes invisible, it thrives unchecked. That is the legacy Kublai Khan left behind, one that demands to be uncovered and remembered. The story of Kublai Khan's hidden world reaches its climax in the realization of how many lives were consumed by it. Thousands of women were taken from their homes, stripped of their identities, and forced into a cycle of exploitation that left no space for hope. Children born into this system were condemned to futures shaped by their father's cruelty, rather than their own potential. Families across the empire carried wounds that could never heal, mourning daughters who had never returned. The scale of suffering is almost impossible to imagine, yet it is essential to confront it if we are to understand the true cost of absolute power. This is where the legend of the wise emperor falls apart. History has often celebrated Kublai Khan as a visionary leader who united cultures and expanded trade. But hidden beneath those stories lies a reality that challenges every notion of greatness. What good are roads and markets when they are built on the backs of the broken? What glory can be claimed by a ruler who could not control his own hunger for domination? To view him only as a figure of progress is to ignore the voices of those who are silenced. True history demands that we see both sides, the public victories and the private horrors. Only then can we grasp the full picture of who he was. The human cost of his reign was not an accident of the times. It was the direct result of unchecked authority. When one man holds power without limits, cruelty is not only possible, it becomes inevitable. Kublai Khan's personal sins were not separate from his empire. They were part of it. His palaces of gold were prisons for women, his courts of splendor were theaters of humiliation, and his image of greatness was a mask hiding a reign of fear. To expose this is not to rewrite history, but to restore it, to give voice to those who were denied it for centuries. In the end, the lesson of Kublai Khan's hidden world is larger than the man himself. It is a warning about the dangers of unchecked power and the ease with which cruelty can be disguised as magnificence. It reminds us that history is often told from the top, but the truth lies in the shadows where the powerless lived and suffered. The women of his harem will never have monuments built in their honor, but their silence speaks louder than any marble statue or golden throne. Their stories, once forgotten, deserve to be remembered as the true measure of an empire's cost. So when you hear the name Kublai Khan, do not think only of the conqueror, the emperor, or the builder of dynasties. Think also of the women who were taken, the children who were lost, and the families who grieved in silence. Think of the hidden world that propped up his throne, and the suffering that was erased from official records. Remember that greatness without humanity is not greatness at all. It is tyranny dressed in silk, and let that truth be the legacy that endures. This is why uncovering hidden histories matters. They force us to question what we are told, to look beyond the polished images of kings and emperors, and to confront the reality that power often hides its sins. Share this story, not for the sake of shock, but for the sake of truth. Let it remind us that every empire has a shadow, and every ruler has a cost. The world deserves to know not only the glory of Kublai Khan, but also the darkness he left behind. Only then can we truly understand history and learn from it.